I'm standing just above Cullercoats Bay, about 10 miles from Newcastle, between Whitley Bay and Tynemouth. And what you see here today is completely different to how this place would have looked 100 years ago. I want to tell you about a culture, a people, a way of life that is now completely vanished, lost to history. I want to tell you about the Cullercoats fish lasses.
The first record here of commercial fishing, so to speak, was in 1644 when Mr. Richard Simpson was given permission to build a boat and work these waters. By the 1670s, Cullercoats was developing as a small port for the shipment of coal and salt, but when these industries suffered or were moved to different areas, the village declined as a harbour for exports. So the people turned to fishing, and by the end of the 18th century, this was one of the best fish markets in the north of England, aided of course by its natural harbour. The boats that the men would take out were known as cobles, flat-bottomed, which allowed launching from and landing upon shallow sandy beaches on the northeast coast.
So the average working day here at Cullercoats would involve the men leaving here very early in the morning, and they'd head out to sea. They'd stay quite near the shore though. The best catch was actually said to be just near Tynemouth Pier. And they'd have lunches packed in small biscuit tins, and they'd call these bait boxes. And this is a term that is still used widely in the northeast today to refer to lunch and lunch boxes, your bait boxes. If the catch was very good that day, they'd stay out a bit longer and they'd meet up again with the fishwives at some point, and they'd give them some more bait to keep them going the rest of the day. Now when they came in after a day's fishing, quite often the men would have a race to see who can get the boat in first. And you'd have people standing up on the cliff tops, often the retired fishermen, the older folk, and they'd be chanting for which one they want to win. They'd be shouting the names of the boats, which often had Christian names such as Mary Jane. That was a very common one.
The fishing lines that were used were 68 fathoms long with around 1,000 hooks apiece. Each hook required at least 2 mussels as the main type of bait. The lines were baited up in the house in the evenings for use the next day, and the fishermen's wives, sisters and daughters would help with this. The fishwives, or fish lasses as they were called here, helped with most activities involved in the fishing business. They went down onto the beaches to help land and sort the fish once the men returned. They'd cut the heads off and pack them into their creels, the wicker baskets, and carry the incredibly heavy load on their backs. The ropes would leave permanent marks on their arms and shoulders. Many would walk, or if they were lucky, they'd catch a lift on a cart or a truck. Some even took the train. They'd travel to many of the neighbouring towns and villages, really anywhere within a 40-mile radius, to sell fish. Most fishwives had a regular round of customers for whom they'd take the best fish, and more often than not they were given cups of tea or even lunch, and they were known to eat and drink more than they could handle to really avoid showing favouritism among customers.
The Cullercoats fishwives were identifiable by their unique and very distinctive style of dress. And fishwives all across the British Isles, specifically Newhaven in Scotland, they all had very unique clothing, but they're all different. Now, the origin of the Cullercoats fishwives' clothing is lost to history, but by the mid-19th century it had pretty much become uniform for the women here.
The Cullercoats outfit consisted of a jacket or bedgown, locally known as the bedgoon or beargoon, which covered the top half of the body along with a shawl, and the shawl was generally plain for working, perhaps knitted or crocheted in grey or black wool. It was worn crossed over at the front, wrapped around the body, tucking in at the back waist. In latter days, cardigans were sometimes bought and worn in preference to shawls, particularly in the summer months. The skirt was worn just above the ankle, or up to the mid-calf length. It tied at the back waist with tapes, but its most distinctive feature is the tucked hemline. The number of tucks was optional, dictated by personal preference. It's argued that the greater the number of tucks, the more stylish the skirt, but the reason is probably more practical in that they added weight and warmth around the legs, providing insulation for outdoor life. If a person couldn't sew themselves, then a lady named Ellen Stocks acted as a dressmaker to supplement her family income. She lived locally in Simpson Street and was also a fishwife.
Now, during the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of redevelopment in Britain, and so much that was architecturally beautiful was destroyed and lost forever. Ugliness was the order of the day.
But here on Simpson Street, the oldest street in Cullercoats I believe, we can still see the original fishermen's houses that the fishwives lived and worked in. We can get an idea of how close-knit this community was and imagine how things were for these hardy people back then. A sharp contrast to some of the more modern buildings that have been erected in recent times. As well as being so hard-working, the fishwives were incredibly house-proud. This was best summed up by one woman that said, "You could eat your meat off that back lane, In their precious spare time, the women would sit out in this lane, on stools or crackets, and chat. They'd smoke their clay tobacco pipes, and they'd knit ganzies or jerseys, or sea boot stockings for their husbands. Ganzies were knitted by the traditional circular 4-needle method, with a seamless, gusseted finish, but incorporated a unique Cullercoats pattern with occasional personal variations in stitch.
Cullercoats was a very tight-knit community. It was expected that you were to marry someone from within this community. You were expected to marry someone who was well versed in the culture and traditions and work of being a fishwife in this area. If you didn't, then that was seen as a bit of a problem. It was seen as asking for trouble, and people were regarded as interlopers, outsiders, to be viewed with suspicion if they entered this lifestyle with no prior background to it.
If a fishwife had a small baby, she left it at home in the charge of an older village woman who minded babies for 1 shilling a day. The older children looked after the toddlers, and prams could be hired for a penny an hour. At the end of each day, it was back home, and having cleaned up, there were lots of lines to be baited, housework to be done, perhaps dough to be prepared for the next day's bacon. Weekends saw the nets spread out over the railings on the seafront. On summer days, the fishwives might sell dressed crabs and lobsters from little tables outside the front doors. They also sold winkles, or willocks as they're locally called. A cupful was scooped up and placed into a square of paper. One important tool of the trade that I mentioned earlier was the wicker basket, the creel. The wicker creel was carried on the back and held about 4 to 6 stone of wet fish. On top of this would be carried another basket, or sometimes the creel was fitted with a small board as a lid, which could be lifted off and used for filleting fish. A very sharp filleting knife was slotted into the wicker on the side of the creel, and some women also took with them a spring balance to weigh out the fish. The women were trained to carry the creel from childhood, small creels being made with a load proportionate to and increasing with their age and strength. The fishwives started work when they were quite young, perhaps 12 or 13 years old. They generally worked with their mothers and gradually took over their own rounds. In the 1820s, local artists discovered the appeal of Cullercoats as a place to paint, and it soon developed a reputation as an artist's colony. But it was an American artist, Winslow Homer, whose work helped to immortalise Cullercoats in the fish lasses. Born in Boston in 1836, Homer was one of the USA's leading artists, and he lived and worked in Cullercoats from 1881 to 1882. He was inspired by the local people and greatly admired their hard work, their way of life and culture. He wrote, "The women are the working bees, stout hardy creatures." He spent his time here lodging in the Huddleston Arms, later the Bay Hotel. The hotel's gone now, but on its spot stands Winslow Court, named after the famous guest. Why he came here is a bit of a mystery. One theory suggests that he had a chat with a passenger on his Atlantic crossing, maybe a resident of Cullercoats, who knows. In any case, he got right to the heart of the community and got a real feel for the place and people. He often hired the women to sit as models for him. If you're in Washington, D.C., be sure to head to the National Gallery of Art and enjoy some of Homer's work, such as this, The Three Fisher Girls. But if Washington is too far away, then closer to home in Newcastle, you can see the magnificent work of another artist, John Chalden, entitled The Women, which depicts local women pulling a lifeboat out to sea on New Year's Day in 1861. The people of Cullercoats had a vocabulary of their own. For example, stocker was a fish other than a salmon caught in a net. Nammy was a big turnip. Suman was swimmin'. Gully was a bread knife. Paddock was a frog, and so on. The fishing community here were very superstitious too. As far as religion went, the fishermen held very strong beliefs, but were not chapel or churchgoers. There was a strong male and female choir attached to the primitive mission, and at the beginning of each season, a service was held on the beach at the water's edge, which everyone attended for the blessing of the sea. The word salmon was taboo. Redfish was substituted instead. The word pig was also never mentioned, particularly on a Friday. If a stranger used the word in your company, touching the nearest piece of cold iron could avert the evil omen. If fishermen heard anyone whistling or saw any cross-eyed person, they'd not go out fishing or would at least go home and set out again. Sea boots had to be carried in a certain way to avoid the prospect of drowning that day. It was considered unlucky to meet or cross a funeral procession too. In the event of a death, blinds were drawn and mirrors were covered until after the funeral. When a dead person was collected for burial, there was singing on the doorstep, then the body was taken directly to the cemetery, not to the church. Old fishermen who died were taken in a procession around the village on what was called their last trip. Unpaid mourners were employed at the death of children or young unmarried girls. 6 unmarried girls were selected for this role, though only 2 attended the funeral of young men. They wore black dresses with white hoods and shawls of white spun silk around their shoulders. The fishwives were renowned for their charitable work, especially their collections for the lifeboat fund. 3 women in particular were known as the lifeboat ladies: Polly Duncan, Nanny Lyle and Bella Madison, and they were awarded the gold brooch for their dedicated service. On the annual Lifeboat Saturday, the lifeboat was hauled manually up the bank, and during the 1920s and 30s, Polly Duncan was seen standing in the boat, a black velvet bag on a cane extended into the crowds, collecting money.
For the last 12 years, these Cullercoat fishwives have made their annual collection, resulting in over 1,500 being raised. A wonderful achievement. Polly Dankin, the 75-year-old leader of these merry fishwives, was awarded a gold brooch by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, who shows his keen interest in the work as President of the institution and as Master of the Merchant Navy and Fishing Fleets.
Jean F. Terry wrote in 1913, "The Cullercoats fishwife, with her cheerful, weather-bronzed face, her short jacket and ample skirts of blue flannel, and a heavily laden creel of fish, is not only appreciated by the brotherhood of brush and pencil, but is one of the most notable sights of the district." William S. Garson, in his 1935 book, The Romance of Old Tynemouth and Cullercoats, wrote, "The Cullercoats fishwife plays a man's part in helping to launch the lifeboat, frequently wading waist-high into the furious and ice-cold waters, and she never hesitates to allow her man to take a place on the boat, even though he may go to face death and disaster." In Scotland there are a couple of statues dedicated to the fishwives, and there's even one in South Shields too, not too far from here, but surprisingly there isn't one in Cullercoats. In fact, there isn't that much that commemorates the proud community that once thrived here.
There is some interpretation here, but it's seen better days for sure.
It's hard to imagine now a community as tight as the one that existed here. Families and friends living and working together, such a close relationship to the soil and the sea. How many people now even know their own neighbour? In more prosperous times, 80 cobles worked out of Cullercoats. By 1905, the number had fallen to 35, and it was down to only 6 in 1974. The culture had faded away and eroded over time, with material shortages during the war changing the traditional elements of the outfits, to increasing costs and expenses making this way of life unsustainable. The advent of supermarkets and the like also contributed. No more did the people of Cullercoats and the wider area get their fresh fish from a local fish lass, but instead they get it wrapped in plastic from Tesco. The Cullercoats fishwives in general are recalled with great affection for their good-humoured and direct manner, their hard work and their longevity. One can only imagine the wit and wisdom that these women once had about them, that's now lost and forgotten. The men and women of Cullercoats didn't change the world, but they were the sort of hard-working people that built this country and exemplified a happy and healthy way to live. There was a unique culture here, and I think that it's right that we remember it and take inspiration from their values of hard work and charity. While it may be sad that this way of life is gone, there are still those such as Lewis Dimmock here that, much like the artists of the 19th century, take artistic inspiration from Cullercoats. You can find a link to his work in the description. In 1862, Edward Corvan wrote a folk song called The Cullercoats Fish Lass, and so I'd invite you to take a listen and enjoy some paintings of Winslow Homer and some old photographs depicting better times.
As a Cullercoats fish lass, so cosy and free, brought up in a cottage close on by the sea, and I sell fine fresh fish to poor and to rich. Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? barefoot and bare-legged I trudge many a week, with a creel on me back and a bloom on me cheek. I'll supply ye with flatfish, fine skate, a fresh ling, and sometimes penny wilks, crabs and lobsters I bring. Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? I work hard for me living, for your friend I near begs, and I hoof the young chaps when they peep at me legs. As healthy and handsome, quite willing and strong, the tall for me living, cry and fish all day long. Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? Will you buy, will you buy, will you buy my fresh fish? As a Cullercoats fish lass, cosy and free, wrapped up in a cottage close on by the sea, and I sell fine fresh fish to poor and to rich. Will you buy, will you buy,